Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon Sterling, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for the kickoff event for the 2020 Black Philanthropy Month Lunch and Learn six-part webinar series. This event is presented by Black Funders of St. Louis, which is a local giving circle. Our members are Black people from all walks of life who agree to make an annual contribution of $300 or more, which is then pooled together with donations from non-members to make awards to Black-led nonprofits in St. Louis every year. Since 2017, we have awarded more than $10,000 to local organizations. In addition, we've been encouraged as members to offer our time and talent to support Black-led nonprofits in the community. Our work is rooted firmly in the pursuit of racial equity and a fairer St. Louis. To learn more about Black Funders of St. Louis, giving circles, this webinar series, you can visit our website, blackfunders.com. I'd also like to acknowledge our fiscal sponsor, Deaconess Foundation, which is providing technical assistance for Black Philanthropy Month's webinar series. And with that, today's roundtable topic is Black-led nonprofits and social change movements. We are joined today by an impressive group of nonprofit professionals and activists to explore this topic. First up, we have Angela Brown, who is the CEO of the St. Louis Regional Health Commission. She leads initiatives to integrate physical and behavioral health services, implement trauma-informed care practices into hospitals and community health services, and administers a $30 million medical coverage program for uninsured and vulnerable adults in St. Louis City and County. Angela has 15 years experience in the nonprofit management sector with a focus on health policy, strategic planning, and community engagement. Next, we have Allison Gibbs, who's the Director of Leadership Development and Special Programs for We Power, where they work with community to redesign education, economic, health, and justice systems to be equitable. In this role, she's the lead designer and facilitator for an initiative called Chisholm's House, or Chisholm's Chair, excuse me, a collective of Black and Latinx women exploring elected and appointed leadership opportunities in the St. Louis region. She has worked on several electoral campaigns and ballot initiatives in Florida and Tennessee. And in addition, in 2015, she helped found Just City, a criminal justice reform organization. Next up, we have a local legend, Jamala Rogers, who is a founding member and the executive director of the organization of Black Struggle, a group of veteran activists, students, union organizers, and community members working to address the needs and issues of the Black working class. She has been intimately involved in grassroots efforts addressing racial justice, political power, and transformative democracy. She's the author of Ferguson is America, Roots of Rebellion, and The Best of The Way I See It, and other political writings. She's also a featured columnist for the Black weekly newspaper, the St. Louis American. Finally, we have Kiera Anderson. She's the former executive director of the Cornerstone Community Development Corporation, a faith-based nonprofit providing affordable housing to low and moderate income individuals and families in what many of us here in St. Louis have come to know as the area called the Delmar Divide. For the last 2 years, she has led organizational capacity activities for Cornerstone and a large community development planning initiative for the West End neighborhood as one of only 2 nonprofit executives at the moment to receive funding for the Regional Equity Initiative Invest STL. In addition to her work here, Kiera has served marginalized communities in San Jose, California, Kansas City, Missouri, and East St. Louis, Illinois. So I'd like to thank all of you for choosing to join this call with me today. If you like, you can unmic yourself and tell me how you're doing.
Well, I'm doing well today.
Good, 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 good. How are you, Allison?
I'm doing well. I'm happy to be in this virtual space this morning, early afternoon.
Awesome. Kiera?
Same here, always moving forward, and I appreciate sharing this space with you all.
Awesome. And my hero, Jamala, how are you?
I'm doing great. 1 week before the big August 4th election, so I'm doing good.
Absolutely, absolutely. So The topic today is Black-led nonprofits and social change movements. I think before we begin, I think it's safe to acknowledge that 2020 has been unlike any other year in recent decades, okay? Really with a global health crisis as a backdrop, what we've seen is renewed calls for social justice and racial equity, especially after the murders of people like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Those calls have expanded to not only include discussions about things like police reform, but the need for systemic change across a variety of issues for a variety of marginalized populations. And it seems to me that really for the first time in a long time, there are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that understand that the conversation about social justice, things like implicit bias, white privilege, really can't wait anymore, right? And as it pertains to this specific conversation, I think one of the things that we as members of Black Funders of St. Louis have been talking about is that a lot of this discussion and whatever work will come out of it is really centered around a lot of the people that nonprofits provide basic and critical needs for. So it seems logical that we begin to ask ourselves, where do Black-led nonprofits fit in this discussion, okay? So my first question to my esteemed panelists is, what role should Black-led nonprofits play in identifying inequity and racism, if any? Would you like to start with me, Allison?
All right, yes, unmuting myself. So I think they should play a leading role. And I say that with not hesitation, but wanting to balance it, being like, the burden shouldn't be only on us. So we need other folks to engage in the conversation and to be a part and to be allies and co-conspirators and all of those things. But it is our job to play a leading role in that conversation. And I think having been a part of organizations that are primarily advocacy organizations, right? Like I can nerd out and get into all the technical difficulties of different kinds of nonprofits, et cetera. But I know that I have largely been a part of advocacy and organizing organizations, not direct service organizations. So I'll make my distinction there. But I think direct service advocacy, policy, oriented organizations that are Black-led or have large Black staff or working in Black communities, because we also have organizations that are deeply rooted in Black communities and impact Black people, but don't have Black people on staff or in leadership. So I'm lumping all of that in there together to say that we play a critical role, especially organizations that are Black-led, especially organizations that are doing work for, to, with, all of those different terms, Black folks, but may or may not have Black leadership, both in terms of having the conversation as well as doing the actual work itself. So whether we're just the conveners of space and conversations or boots on the ground, or the virtual ground these days, we play a critical role in shaping the conversation, in challenging others in love and in agitation, to do differently and to do better.
So if I could just piggyback off of that, because I too have some issues with the Organization for Black Struggle being called a not-for-profit, because for many years we were not a legal entity in any way or shape or form. It was only after the uprising for Ferguson that we had staff. So for 35 years, we basically were a grassroots organization doing the work. And so I think for a lot of us, the whole notion of nonprofit has some negative connotations, obviously. But based on Allison's spectrum, there is a spectrum. There's the advocacy all the way to actual services and products. And so if you are an organizing organization, what is your unit of service? And so I think that we have to continue to stretch that definition of what it is like, but to actually get to the question, we absolutely have a responsibility and role to do that, to push the issue of, challenging racism, whatever forms that comes in, as well as advocating for folks who look like us, whether they be co-workers or clients. One of the things I found interesting after the Ferguson uprising, where we had the Ferguson Commission and the recommendations, and all of a sudden I started to see mainstream nonprofits add racial equity to their mission or somehow tagline. And I'm thinking, okay, I hope the Black people in those those nonprofits are challenging them, because just because you add a symbolic phrase does not mean that you have checked off that box. And for some of those, they have a historic, you know, reputation of not being fair, not only to its employees, but having a patriarchy or a missionary approach to their Black clients. And so yeah, we have to be on the inside and the outside, holding people accountable.
So I want to sit in something that you just said. You said that some organizations have a missionary approach or outlook about their clients, and I think that's an interesting commentary. It makes me ask the question, or maybe form two questions. One is, how difficult, and this is a good question for Angela and Kiera, how difficult is it for an organization that isn't established to do this kind of grassroots social justice oriented advocacy work to bring conversations about inequity and racism to the forefront? And also, how do we train our peers to be a part of that conversation without it coming off as paternalistic, maybe even a little patronizing, right? How do we lead our professional peers and our organizations along? But how do we do that? Any thoughts?
I will jump in because Jamala's statement struck me too, because right after, you know, the Ferguson Commission work, and we did the Ford through Ferguson, I was on several boards, and everybody kind of, even my own organization, we moved to now, we have this racial equity term. And our organization itself does a lot for the underserved. We call it underserved, under-resourced communities that we worked a lot with. But in terms of what do we actually do? How do our boards, how does our staff reflect this mission? How do the processes and systems we have in place allow us to think in terms of equity? I think for a lot of people, you know, when they say equity, they don't understand you have to shift resources in order to make that happen. And what does that really look like? And when you start talking about those hard terms and really having to deal with your own biases, it's where you feel a lot of the pushback and hesitation to want to move forward, operate outside of their comfort zone. And so I do think there's a responsibility for Black-led organizations, Black people who are in leadership positions that have relationship to help move people along in that. But I think, as Alice was saying, it is hard for us to want to help white people process their bias and, you know, understand and make them not feel like they're racist. That becomes a difficult conversation, but using our influence of ways to help push organizations to the next level. And, you know, there's different ways we do that with data. For a lot of the ways that we've been able to do it, personal experience, trying to push having people with that lived experience at the table, partnering more with non-traditional or non-mainstream, I should say non-mainstream nonprofits that are actually boots on the ground doing the work to really help lead those conversations to get us to the next level. And I've seen that work when people actually see the, you know, people with the lived experience at the table speaking and leading. And I don't know if they feel guilt or whatever, but it helps them at least forget some of the hesitation and some of their own internal issues to help move the conversation to the next level. And especially after the thing we just saw with Greater Floyd. That renewed energy, even more people have come out with statements. We've seen some of our major hospitals who have probably never come out with statements, BJC to speak of one, around racial equity and the things they're trying to move inside their system. And from my position, I'm like, oh, we started to talk about it. But now to see people actually like, how do we fund this? How do we put people in these roles to have that conversation? even my own organization itself, we've been around about 20 years, but we were led by a white male for 19 of those years. You know, I just came in as a Black female. So even seeing that shift in some of the larger organizations that we have is at least bringing some awareness, giving us a little bit more power, increasing, I feel like, the responsibility of us to have that voice, to bring those conversations to the table, to push a lot of these systems further into addressing the racism, anti-bias behavior that we have.
Angela, that's a very similar experience to my experience the last 4 years. And so Jamala and Allison, what I'm bringing together here is the last person in a sense to sort of contribute to the discussion is that, first off, let's just acknowledge the dopeness of Black leaders. We are discussing leaders, but then also educators to boards whether or not if they're predominantly white in Black communities. And then Black undersourced, under-resourced communities. And so I would say, just to speak to that first question as well as the last question, Brandon, a lot of where we are really resourceful is the fact that many of our grassroots organizations that are Black-led are building relationships with the people. And that's significant there, is to just have that connection between the family, the communities that we're serving. And there's another layer to it when we are Black-led in a predominantly Black community with a predominantly white board. And so that's why I wanted to start off acknowledging the dopeness that it takes for Black leaders being in that space. And so I, really want to thank each of you, but then also keeping in mind that it's interesting when we talk about this work, but then also considering that place of arrival and what that may look like.
So while we're here for a minute, I'm tempted to say that, and so tempted that I will say, is that why the idea of critical mass is real, that it appears that there's more people than ever that are interested in having these conversations, or at bare minimum, understanding that the conversation can't be avoided, right? Some of this is familiar. So at least probably one of my greatest concerns is finding a way to ensure, and I think Angela kind of touched on it a little bit, that really at the crux of this, there's an issue of power sharing, right? And allowing a voice to be heard that isn't mainstream, which is really kind of a polite way of saying white, right? So what do we need to do to make sure that, Bank of America made an announcement a few months ago saying they were going to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into Black communities. I think I had this conversation with one of you, offline. The question becomes is how? Where is that money going to go? Who's going to facilitate that process? Where's that money going to be sat at? What types of people will make decisions about who's involved in discussing what organizations, what consultants, what type of infrastructure needs to be placed, what types of language, what types of values or outcomes need to be expected. And I'd like to sit in that for a minute and just get your feeling on that. Whether that be your experience here in St. Louis or anywhere else, this idea that, we see this surge of awareness or sense of urgency, using Ferguson here in St. Louis as a good example. What do we do to make sure that when people start saying, I'm willing to work on a solution, I'm willing to fund a solution, to make sure that we're at the table?
I think we have to be willing to hold people to their vocal promises, right? This is not an example from the philanthropic nonprofit space. This is actually from like the business space that's just coming like to mind. I think it was like a Black designer or a Black beauty founder who was basically, publicly making it known via Instagram and maybe Facebook, like, okay, this corporation said they're gonna have this much space on their shelves for Black designers. I'm really thinking about it in the beauty space, to be honest. And so it was a challenge that she was calling these companies out said, okay, Target, you make X amount of money, but you're only allocating this amount to have folks on your shelves. Hey, Sephora, you know, all these different big companies. And it was just making it plain and clear to say, all right, I've got this company, they said they're going to do 10% of their thing. This other company is going to do, and just like not letting up, like not letting the verbal commitment just stand. Like, we're going to give $100,000. You know, if you're a corporation that only has $1 million annual revenue, that's a significant chunk. But if you're $1 billion corporation, like, that's cute. That's also like a PR stunt. Like, that doesn't even cover 2 well-paid salaries, right?
Man,
So like,
I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, I'm like, and I mean, like, it's for the executive level salaries, you know,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that I'm all capitalist, but also thinking about the world as it is, right? And thinking about our realities right now versus what we want to be true in the future, potentially. That's cute. That's a start, but that's not enough. And like, being bold and not just taking crumbs, I think is super important. And like, really leveraging this moment and not letting folks off the hook, especially the large corporations, especially the Wells Fargo, especially the Bank of America, like especially those institutions where we know they got deep pockets, and we also know that they are deeply contributory to these systems, like either directly or just indirectly, just by being, you know, blind to certain realities, but especially for the ones we
playing
know.
the position of neutrality, right?
Yeah. So the neutral ones, but especially the ones we know that are directly culpable, we hold them publicly accountable.
Well, one of the things that I've been talking and writing a lot about, just based on this recent upsurge after the George Floyd murder, it is more people willing to have the conversation, and there's a lot more what I call concessions, meaning what does it take to keep people off your back? How much money is that going to mean? So that people don't look really at you and start looking internally at your infrastructure. So I remember one of the examples I used was our friend over there at the NFL, you know, who came out with an apology and I'm going to do this much money. And I'm like, dude, you had a chance to have an open mind and heart when you kicked Kaepernick off out of the NFL. So I'm really not wanting to hear you right now. You better put down something very concrete and very tangible before you make a believer out of me. And I would say that to most of the other corporations in particular, that a lot of what's being done is tokenism and symbolism that's not going to mean like transformative change for us. And so if we don't put a tangible demand or a tangible goal or a tangible outcome and say, this is what we're looking for, and if you don't want to do this, then all of this other stuff is just, you know, fluff and BS. So many folks across the country started looking at defunding the police. And some of them went a step further to say, let's get the police out of our public schools, because those are the schools that have police presence, but no nurses, no social workers, no. So what kind of, I mean, really, like
where are our priorities?
Yeah, what are our priorities? And your priorities are going to be dictated by where your money goes. And so I'm part of the group that's been pushing the St. Louis public schools to get the police out of there, and there's reluctance. But in other places across the country, they realized, again, they weren't paying attention and they were doing knee-jerk stuff. And so they got police in and realized, okay, we still got this. Now we got this the school to prison pipeline. This seems like an opportunity for us to reassess our budget and really have a student-centered, family-centered, you know, goals. And so I think if we always put, in my estimation, I always put children first, put them in the center, all the other stuff is going to come out right. But I think these folks need to be held accountable that are throwing this money around, because the other thing that happens, and y'all know this, that they will pick some Black folks who are going to get the money. And those folks are going to be living large, but still it never did the trickle down. So I'm saying
we have many examples of that here in St. Louis over the years.
That's why I say I know y'all know.
So let me ask you guys a quick question. so, and I appreciate what, Allison and Jamala, both as people who've worked in organizations, but who are also activists, are really kind of illustrating for us. So I want to throw a little bit of monkey wrench in there. So a part of this was about acknowledging that all of us, whether we do direct service or whether we do policy and administer funds, like Angela's organization, the issue of inequity and racism are things that should be important to all of us, right? And I think, I've said this quite a bit over the last few months. I think there's almost an obligation to earnestly look for the root causes of why we have people who are underinsured, why we have people who are homeless, why we have people that are in jail for what would now be a misdemeanor possession of marijuana, or in some states, not even a misdemeanor anymore, right? So some people are obviously in that space as activists, and maybe dual roles as activists and nonprofit professionals. What work do the rest of us need to do who are running traditional Black-led nonprofits to really get up to speed? How do we help you and not hinder you, right? How do we do that work without sucking up your space too? I mean, there's a few really big Black-led nonprofits in St. Louis that I don't think would call themselves advocacy organizations. They might be on the call today, right? How do they get involved without displacing leadership, right?
So Brandon, this actually, I'll take a stab at this first. A really great question, especially as we know that this is a time and area where people are going to want to have conversations. Individuals and groups are going to be more funds going to come down the pipeline, and people are going to want to pour out into Black communities. I think it's going to be important for those Black-led organizations to catch that moment, but then also be able to identify what is our goal, what are we willing to accept, and how will we put these funds to use, but then coupling that with this capacity building approach, which is really needed. In the sense of why. So it's in order for, because you asked the question in terms of how might help be provided. But there needs to be I think it would be helpful for there to be a consensus around where are we ultimately trying to arrive? What is our goal? And then back to, which is what Jamala mentioned, is being able to hold those organizations as well as those funders accountable. But then, which we know many of the grassroots Black organizations have predominantly white boards, but holding those boards accountable as well. Because these Black-led nonprofits, there are boundaries that are put up, especially when those board members, the board is comprised of predominantly white individuals.
So we are going to get to that portion of it in a minute too. I want to acknowledge that we have a couple questions in the box, and some of that is about that. I want to sit in something for you for just a second. And, Kiara, you mentioned the idea of training, capacity building for organizations that might not naturally be in the advocacy space to do this work.
The work session more than training, because training assumes that there's something that we don't already know. And I'm just saying a space for us to get together collectively and strategize around what are we going to ask for? Okay. What is it that we would like to see, so that when the funding does come down, we've already talked about this. We know how we spend our money. We know what we need. We know why and how to operate in a better way so that the people ultimately can benefit.
And just to add on that, I feel there's kind of the disconnect with our grassroots organizations and some of our larger funding corporate type of business organization. And for Black leaders who understand system, how do we begin to bridge that gap? How do we, like Kiara said, we know what the agenda is, we know what the community priorities are because we have relationship there, but then we also know how to translate that into you know, the language for the system that we all have to operate in order to get funding. And so how do we take, I understand, you know, I'm working on a project now. We have a lot of advocates. They just want to do the work. They understand it. They're with the community. They're from the community. But then they don't understand some of the politics behind it. Like, you have to say it this way to get the funder to understand what you mean. The, you know, the catchphrase language of how we're addressing disparities and all these other things. And so how do we take some of our learnings from being within the systems, for those of us who are on the inside of systems, and to help bridge that gap to really get the funds to flow to where it needs to flow. The other things that we're trying to push, we have in our region, it's a very small program, but it's called participatory budgeting, where we actually have community leaders at the table making the funding decisions. And even on top of that, there's still politics, but at least at a start, how do we get those people at the table once we have their, you know, they have the expertise, as Kiara said. It's not a training, but it's really bridging that gaps of for a white audience to understand what we're trying to say in order to really reach community.
I want to add to that really quickly, because I'm thinking about like this insider outsider strategy, right? And I'm just going to think about like a one kind of system. So if we're thinking, for example, like healthcare system, right? If you've got folks that are doing organizing and advocacy work, working on the policy end of healthcare, and you have a whole host of like direct service providers, whether it's, you know, public health providers and providing ad hoc services to the more institutional provision of healthcare, hospitals, you know, clinics, et cetera. How do we come together in a space, right? And organizers can provide political cover, right? We could potentially be the heavy or be the fall guy. Sorry, my lighting changed. Be the heavy or be the fall guy for something that comes up, but can hold people to account and provide protection for the direct services, for the direct service providers, so that, you know, there's this larger systemic change that needs to happen. But what they risk is not having enough money to provide a hospital bed or to provide, you know, reproductive justice, like reproductive services, right? So how can we work together so that the organizing and advocacy organization, we can be rah-rah, right? But we know we're working in concert with the direct service provider, because what we don't want to see is a Black or Latinx or white or any of our brothers and sisters not get like the immediate thing that they need, while we also continue to push systems. So it's just something I'm like thinking about, of making sure that like we're working together, because exactly to Kiara's point, not so much that the folks working in direct service don't know, it's just like what they risk by saying X is potentially 100, you know, beds or 100 meals or something that people most directly need. And so thinking strategically of how we can play politics together smartly.
So it sounds like what you're suggesting is that we acknowledge, whether we're in direct service or policy or actual on the ground advocacy work, that there's mutual interest there, and there's an opportunity for us to play some roles that complement one another. For those of us that may be involved in non-advocacy work, we may know systems, we may know people, relationships, history, politics, that's shared in a unique way with us that allows us to inform the work that advocates do, right? Or activists do. And activists have a little bit more room and latitude to push the envelope a bit in ways that maybe traditional nonprofits can't, right? Is that a fair assumption? I do want to say this, and I have talked to, I think, most of you about this offline, is that, so here's the thing, and this brings me back to the point that even though this feels really big for the first time in a long time, it's not really new. And I think one of the things that we do have to acknowledge is that a lot of us have jobs and families and mortgages and a variety of obligations, right? That it can be tempting to not do anything because of that. And I think while I acknowledge what you just said, and I think that's actually very, very smart, and one of the things I would say as a result of that is that advocates and traditional nonprofits need to make more time to meet, right? Having said that, I'll play devil's advocate and I'll say that it doesn't absolve us as executive directors and CEOs of traditional nonprofits to find a way to push the envelope, right? Having said that, I'm going to address some of what's happening in the Q&A box and pose a question to the group, which is essentially that I think we acknowledged earlier, is that there are Black leaders of white organizations, right? Those organizations may have a regional or statewide impact, or they may serve very specific communities that happen to be all Black or intentionally Black. The question becomes is, how can they position their organizations to have a role in social justice if it's not their core identity? And how do they do that in a way that doesn't alienate their colleagues, their board members? And I'm gonna add this little twist to it. Ask people to be honest in confronting whatever issues they have with implicit bias or stereotypes or whatever else. So how do people that are in that space, because that's the space a lot of us are in. Some of us don't have the luxury of having an all Black board or all Latin board, right?
So Brandon, in answering that question, I do want to push back on the comment that you said. You said something to the effect that we share mutual interest, and that's not always the true. And so that's the thing that creates tension in the room. So we all maybe have the same clientele or the same target community, but our interests are quite different. So for a lot of nonprofits, it's this whole, and I'll use the word missionary again, because most people of faith understand that, this whole thing of proprietary, like these are my things, these are my widgets that I get to count, and the more I have, the more I count, and the more money I get, as opposed to some of us who are looking at it from the standpoint that we are really trying to empower our communities. We're trying to create critical thinkers who can make decisions for their families, for their communities. That's not necessarily the goal of a lot of non-for-profits, because as long as they keep people needy and dependent, then they have, job security. I ain't down with that. I'm trying to work myself out of something so that it's other people that are lifting up the issues, and they're the fighters of it where they are, and they see the connection between this candidate and their standard of living, or they see how expanding Medicaid or not expanding it has impacted the health and life of their community. That's the kind of folks that I'm trying to create, not folks that are going to come to the door and say, do you have some groceries for me? I want you to know why you don't have groceries, why there is homelessness. So, it's not mutual interest.
You know what?
So, yeah.
I'll acknowledge that. I think that's real. I think that there are some people who are in the space that treat it like any other job, and that can be problematic. And I think there are others that may be fearful, or there may be others that are just, we're humans. I think there are some people that just do their job. I got trained to be a social worker. I got hired to administer self-sufficiency classes, and they don't look beyond that. I think that's our responsibility as fellow peers and colleagues at different levels to ask people to look to those root causes rather than to just be settled in the work, or we'll be doing it forever. Yeah. I think I told the story to one of you that, I was having a conversation with somebody about just generations and generations of people. I met a woman once years ago when I was working with the homeless population who had never known a single family member who didn't live in a homeless shelter, on someone else's couch, or in Section 8 housing. And this is when I told her that we were going to help her eventually get her own place. She said that was about as likely as her owning a Rolls Royce one day. Okay, so having said that, that's acknowledging that she has met with many, and her family members have been engaged by many nonprofits over their lifetime. The question becomes what's the difference in level of commitment and what we're really getting to? I do want to mention a book that's pretty interesting, written by a gentleman down south called Toxic Charity, which from my standpoint does a really good job of talking about aiding and abetting rather than investing and empowering your clients. So certainly for those that are on the call that have never heard it, it's a great tool to take a lot of people through a paradigm shift. They do workshops and all kinds of great stuff. But let's get back to the other question really quickly. So what do organizations that may be led by Black people but have a preponderance of either white staff or white board members, like how do we help them broach that topic? Certainly now if not ever, right? How do we do that?
I will just piggyback off of some, Jamala, she did say that we don't have the same mutual interests, but there are usually opportunities for alignment. So from the healthcare space, what we found, providers understand patient satisfaction, they understand their metrics that they have to do, where they get penalized from. And so usually we need to address issues of how they are showing up in community, treating patients, or responding, that we can leverage those opportunities. The other leverage point we also fund those organizations. And so there's a piece of compliance that comes with that to help move people to begin to address some of the issues that we're talking about today. So, while, we don't always have mutual interest, but at least trying to find a place of alignment to at least start the conversation has been helpful. But as an organization, like my board is majority white. There are a bunch of hospital leaders, healthcare leaders, so which are usually led by white people, mostly male. So struggle with a lot of this. And then how do you bridge those conversations to really elevate the needs of the community in a way that is respectful for our community, but also does not alienate a board. And so definitely a struggle for a lot of organizations who, at least from my position as I sit in this role, to figure that out, but at least finding some common interest that people tend to understand. And again, I think the movement now is pushing a lot of people to think differently about how they operate. So able to at least move a little differently, because nobody wants to be seen as the racist in the room. So it does help conversation just a little in terms of how you move and operate. But definitely, when you think about how they are funded, or the hospitals are funded, our health centers are funded, and how you can help improve those metrics, really helps. And we have a major issue with addressing Black males in the healthcare system and how they're getting service, and being able to change the way we operate and think about care, healthcare in the system that is operated in is a major issue that, we're broaching the subject. Each year, I think we're getting closer and closer, but definitely a struggle of how do you move people to understand a lot of the anti-bias and racism behavior that are not only at the top, but within the staff. So you serve majority Black people, but then all the staff are white, and you wonder why people can't come in, why they can't connect. And so how do you begin to deal with a lot of those issues? Is that what we're trying to broach on now?
I'd like to add to that piece, and I realize I made a comment in the chat and it went to all the panelists and not to attendees, so I apologize. But this is really making me think about like the art of the one-on-one, right? And this is a term that's used in like the organizing space, but really having this conversation with folks to really understand what their self-interests are, right? Because their interest of their organization may be one thing, but what is their actual self-interest? Because they may have to operate and say certain things as they represent their organization because of the boundaries and how far they're personally willing to go to push those. But getting an understanding of who you're talking to and who's at the table, and I might be putting a controversial idea out there, but maybe everybody shouldn't be at your table, right? If they fundamentally don't, and I know that that's different, like I may not like you, I may have like beef with you personally, or we have a difference in opinion on a thing, that's different than we fundamentally have. You think you operate from a very paternalistic mindset that Black people always need your help. I'm just thinking about it from like the toxic charity standpoint, like that we are less than, that we are always needing help, this, that, and the third. And maybe you've come to that thinking because of our other systems of oppression, right? Everybody's a victim, Black folks, white folks, etc. But are you willing to be challenged on that and question it and think differently? It's one thing if like I'm here, but I'm here in my thinking because that's all I know, versus when you're challenged and questioned and you have no capacity for growth or thinking differently or expanding your thought. That's when I would personally think maybe this funding relationship actually isn't a good fit. Because even though the money can be, and there's no, there's this idea of clean money, good money, like we can get into a lot of philosophical debates about that, but there's certain relationships that sometimes if the funder has this, and I have like my own experience in this, like if the funder has this very deep fundamental belief about the people that they're giving money to, and then that's going to fundamentally control how the money is used, both in terms of a direct service standpoint, but also the way in which you can operate to push the envelope, that may be a relationship you have to walk away from. So that's like, I think about like, how can we bring people along and what the openness is, but if there are folks that are fully closed off and not interested in learning, growing, having conversation, at what point do you need to step away from that relationship and focus your time and attention and energy to doing other things, is something that I would offer as thought there, and bringing it to like the organizing space, the one-on-one in a series of one-on-ones helps you continuously reassess the relationship and reassess folks' self-interest.
So go ahead, Kiera, go ahead.
I do want to add to that, Allison, and this is much of my thought, and please don't confuse this with, just me being impatient, but maybe I am impatient, rightfully so. We talked a little bit about empowering people. And when I consider empowering people, I'm also considering what about some of the residents in my neighborhood eventually becoming a board member. And I'm very impatient of trying to get white board members to understand the role of a board. One of the greatest roles is governing. And so if I have to teach you and educate you at a board level, I'm sorry, but my mind is so much more focused on the people who we are actually here for. I think that's a different job for me. And so I am in a place where I am very impatient with trying to teach white people as board members. I think you can recognize, we can have this conversation, a very intimate conversation, on maybe this isn't fitting any longer, if this is the direction of the organization. And I think we need to be intentional as Black leaders about empowering people in our communities to understand. I mean, I can tell you, my cousins on Section 8 probably would make a great board member someday, but it takes Black leaders to actually bring that information to families, to their parents, to their cousins, and talk about what it may look like to serve in that capacity.
And convince their professional peers
that
they have to share power. And they have to share power with people who may not be in their same socioeconomic class. Yeah.
But then you have to also release your structure of what your boards operate and rethink structure. Time
right.
and
so it's interesting that you say that, Angela. So one of the workshops that'll be coming up, one of the next sessions in the Lunch and Learn series, one of the presenters is Marissa Payne, and she and I were having a discussion, just about the idea of racial equity and organizational health. And here's the reality, in talking to her and one of her peers, is that you can't really just solve for that problem with training. You really have to do an organizational shift. You have to commit to an identity change, which is a part of the reason why I was discussing that book, because it really talks about from engaging people who are everybody from facilities worker to CEO, and getting them involved in that process and part of that conversation. Board members, not allowing anybody to just sit on the sideline and threaten progress. Like, they've got to actually be involved and challenge themselves in some way. And I do think that that's important. And I think to Allison's point, I think all of us, and I think you might be tempted, if you're on the call, to hear Allison and say, well, she's talking about the activists who just happen to run organizations. And I think that's real for all of us. I think we all need to look at, who we engage, who we get money from, and need to be continually deciding whether those are good relationships. And I spent a lot of time in the last 4 years as ED of the CDC, really challenging stakeholders and funders to really like get in deep with us, right? To not give us really small amounts of money, not to give us lip service, but to really walk the whole thing with us, you know, whether that's making sure that you've got, I mean, we've convinced city departments to assign staff people to attend community meetings twice a month for 3 years. I want a staff person there. I don't want a scenario where we're working out a solution and then we get stalled out for a month because you don't want to be at the table on a regular basis because there's some liability or perceived liability with that, right? But it is important that we look at our relationships, and it's important that we protect our relationships, right? Especially if what we're suggesting today is that in some cases, there's room for traditional nonprofits and groups that do activism work to pair up, that we need to be intentional about who else we let in that space with each other. So I'm going to go through this box and see if there's any other questions before I move to some of the ones that I already planned. I just want to kind of honor some of the enthusiasm that's going on here. It looks like most of it's centered around that same type of topic that we've been talking about. I think that's a stress point for a lot of people. So maybe this is where I push back a little bit. I believe that a lot of nonprofit leaders, whether they be Black or otherwise, are primarily focused on service delivery. And at least some of what I've heard from funders in the region is that we struggle to, and it may be fair or unfair, so I'll leave it for you to really react to proving that we're experts who can contribute to policy solutions, right? And really describing beyond saying, hey, look, I'm Black, I empathize with my own folks. You know, if you're looking for a partner, I'm it. Like really being able to articulate what we bring to the table. The question is are we ready for that role, and are we kind of being kept out? Or do some of us have some work to do, you know, in terms of not just being service delivery experts, but people that understand policy, big picture, strategy, relationship building, that may take time for that to mature, right? Any thoughts? Jamila looks like she has something she wants to say, but she's not sure if she's gonna say it.
That's like a big old question. So I'm just
It
trying to
is.
think about pieces of it, because, and part of it is I keep thinking about the opportunity that we have right now, that we don't know how long it's going to last in terms of people being open and demands being made. But certainly any demand that's going to be made, there has to be the capacity to follow through and make sure it gets realized. And that's, I think, what's lacking in a number of our communities that have been like marginalized and sometimes don't even understand the role that government plays in making decisions that impact their lives for generations. So, I mean, it's easy to say, I ain't voting, I don't care what happens, my life hasn't changed. Well, yeah, that's probably true for a lot of folks. But if there's a critical mass that begins to hold even local leaders, local elected officials accountable, and then deal with them, and then start with, okay, who are the businesses in your community that you think need to be doing something else? So when I think about Kiara's point about governance, and to me, that's one of the things I think we don't do a good job of teaching our people about governance. And I'm talking about even in the organizations that we have in terms of what does a democratic space look like?
Right.
And in the broader terms, what's our vision for the St. Louis region in terms of what does power sharing look like? What does true democracy look like? And we could actually have some of that modeling being done on the board level between board and communities. But you know, still I see people want to be in their comfort zones. And so there's a need for us to push them out, but also create spaces that are not just venting spaces, but where there actually is going to be some conversations that are going to move people. So I think about this a lot. So that's what I got to say about it. Like, how do we shift things? What is it going to look like 6 months from now, a year from now, in St. Louis with all that we have going on here. We got some important elections coming on, but there's also what's the vision for the city, and what's our particular responsibility to moving ourselves and the constituencies that we have some influence over, to move them as well.
So bringing up politics, so some people say that there really isn't a, or there isn't at least a consensus on, what constitutes a Black agenda. Some people, I don't know that I necessarily agree with this next comment, but some people would argue that there isn't a Black community, or at least not a homogenous thinking Black community, which in some senses may be fair. So to the nonprofits that are on the call, what would you suggest that they do to determine how they prioritize issues or how they offer support to activists, when there may not be the luxury of a document, right? I think every once in a while we get lucky. We saw that as one of the byproducts of the Ferguson initiative is that we got an actual working document, but we don't always get that, right? So how do you help the average nonprofit figure out where they fit in that space and what to prioritize?
I think about so some of the work that WePower is doing currently, and I know that there are other organizations that operate off of this model, is really deeply listening to constituents. I mean, that might seem simplistic, but maybe the answer is simple. I don't know. But again, borrowing from kind of the organizing space and advocacy space, you need to listen to your people and you need to hear what their concerns are. I also think it's important and smart to marry that with data, right? And look what the policy wonks are saying, what's coming from the ivory tower, because there's value in that. But legit canvassing folks, knocking on doors, calling people, texting people to hear from them. Sometimes the simplest solutions aren't the ones people want to do because they want to just pay a group of consultants to go give them this report and give them this data, but actually talking to people and hearing what they need. And so I fully also understand that that may be beyond what a direct service nonprofit can do in terms of their budget or their timing. So I fully understand those potential limitations, but that's where I'm going to go back to being in partnership and community with other organizations that do that, with WePower that does listening, with Action St. Louis, with Organization for Black Struggle. There's other organizations that we are deeply embedded in listening to folks on the ground and leveraging our capacity and really our charge to do that work, and making sure that that information isn't just kind of us, banging the drum at elected officials or appointed leaders or whatever, but organizations in the direct service space are also using that to inform service delivery, as well as to inform their own strategy for pushing funders and for pushing, their corporate structures around how they provide service for folks. But you have to listen to your people, and there's a lot of different ways of doing that. And you could hire a firm to make that happen, or you can connect with organizations that do this.
So that's the miracle of technology, is that some of this stuff can be done on the cheap these days. And I echo your sentiments. I think the last 4 years, I was able to do a lot of surveying. And I think a lot of times, especially board members, why are you pushing out a huge survey to a bunch of people? What's the end result? I said, I don't know. That's the whole point of doing survey, right? Asking questions, figuring out where needs are, trying to anticipate real-time shifts in attitudes. And it sits somewhere between there. And I think even Angela brought that up earlier, the idea that you can inform the people that you work with, your colleagues, your board members, with data, with research. You can also combat stereotypes, and you can show people their implicit bias, right? By taking the work. And a lot of times some of that work is already existing in that space. I think Angela or someone else may have wanted to comment too.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Allison's point that hopefully, because my first thought was just listen to your people, listen to the people with the experience, but it's also taking what they say and actually acting on it, which I feel like we do a lot of needs assessments in St. Louis every time a new issue come up. But how do we really put that into action and actually address the issues that community are saying, is one of the things. And then the other point I just want to make, just from a higher level thing of thinking about nonprofits and kind of the scarcity mindset that has been put in place, I think just from the system that we operate in, where we always think we have to compete when we're serving the same people, the dollars are continue to be limited. So how do we really, when you talk about kind of having this Black agenda, but how do we really have stronger partnerships across organizations to really push a common agenda to address a lot of the issues that we're trying to address? Sorry, my daughter just got here. But
we love kids.
yeah, really thinking about when we talk about having a Black agenda, we know what the community priorities are, but how do we begin to work together to address those, to really have that community impact that we want to see together? Is really, I think we have a lot of work to do around that space.
I just want to echo this part about data and reports, because we got so many of those. I mean, I thought, first of all, we got the Ferguson Commission that pretty much has recommendations that people can just, I always say, pick one. Well, just pick one and work on it. And then we have like the For Sake of All, that humongous health report. What have we done with that? I mean, we have had data. The children's report that Vision for Children at Risk puts out. We got the data. What I would like to see is working groups that actually say, we're going to take this portion of it and we're going to do some benchmarks. And in 5 years, we're going to do bloom, bloom, bloom. We're going to have less of this. We're going to have more of this. I mean, we get stuck in the data and then it sits on the shelf and nothing really happens. I mean, I even go back all the way to the Turner Commission report in 1968. It says, why are Black people always every once in a while like having rebellions? Duh. I mean, we come on, people. Are we just
and the answer is the same today
what?
as it was then.
Yes.
So, there's a couple things that come to mind as you talk, Jamala. Number one is that I do believe that we need to be careful to not fall into the trap of, once we've built critical mass and people are willing to talk about something, having people that wield a lot of power or influence relegate that to another thing that can be pushed out over a 2-3 year study. Because quite frankly, there are plenty of studies and there's virtually nothing new is happening. What we're just seeing is a kind of a cycle, right? A vicious cycle. I think the other thing is, and actually, you know what? I can take Charlie's question. It's really an issue of, power dynamics and the need to really acknowledge that there needs to be a shift between impacted people and people who hold power, so we can actually do something with that information. I would certainly suggest that nonprofits, even those that aren't involved in advocacy work on a day-to-day basis, take what you've said to heart, which is find one of those existing things like the Ferguson study and pick a thing and commit to an actual measurable outcome. I think we all lament time over time about the idea of meeting after meeting after meeting. And at some point there's a need for action. And whether you have to build collaborations or partnerships to get some of that stuff done, we do have to make a commitment to that. Before we get much further along, I do want to go back and deal with one of the questions that was in the Q&A box, because I think it's a little nuanced. Somebody mentioned something specifically about having discussions with donors, which is different than funders. So typically, when we talk about donors, we're talking about individuals, some of them very wealthy, that may, as a result of giving over a long-term time, have a lot of influence over your direction. And I will say that to the audience member that wrote that, I have definitely been in that place before. Actually, I brought up this book, Toxic Charity, and one of the big reactions was that a group of donors, an affinity group, were threatening at the time, well, maybe we won't make gifts to your organization, right? There were others that asked a lot of questions that didn't draw a line in the sand, but certainly had questions. And I think for us, it's a commitment to information and learning how to articulate where you sit and where you want to go and what's important for your clients. And really driving home the point that the place that you're at is about not compromising what it takes to get a high quality of life for the people that you work for, right? And really challenging people to figure out, challenging donors to make a decision about whether or not their hesitation is really about their own comfort level or about what they think is going to be delivered on the end for clients. If it's about clients, then I'll walk you through how we get there, going through this paradigm shift, having these conversations. If it's about you, then the point of giving is about doing for others, not making ourselves feel good, right? So I know that's an ongoing challenge, and I know dealing with individual donors, especially really wealthy ones, can be very challenging. And maybe at some point we'll do a webinar specifically about that topic. But before I move on to any new question, anybody have a burning comment they want to drop in?
There was something that Brand Foundation, I answered it because I saw it pop up in the Q&A. I see people doing Q&A and in the Zoom chat, but I just wanted to make sure it got lifted because I don't know if one exists. So they were asking, is there a documented manifesto around what we as Black-led nonprofits want from Black and non-Black professionals, funders, entrepreneurs, and other community members so that the agenda is clear and public, similar to the Ferguson Commission report? If there isn't one, is there any opportunity to create one? So I just wanted to
Wow,
and got covered.
That's a big question. So I've been around long enough to say never. It could be something that is just I'm not aware of. I don't know that Black nonprofits have ever articulated exactly what they need from in terms of relationships from Black entrepreneurs, people in the corporate space, all that kind of stuff. I don't know if Jamala feels like she's heard of something like that in her time as an activist, but certainly it's something that can be doable. Again, kind of alluding to one of the other webinars that'll come at the end of the month, we'll be assembling a group of Black-led giving circles from all over the country. A total of 6 or 7 will get involved in that call. And, even in assembling that group, one of the things that we talked about was doing some offline discussions and determining how we can work together to leverage this moment, this opportunity that Jamala talks about. And really, as Allison alluded to earlier, really help some of those corporations, right? And some of those bigger institutions invest in us more appropriately and make sure they follow through on this interest that they've expressed, right, in the moment. But yeah, it's not an easy question to get to, but I think certainly I think there's a lot of Black people who are, as a matter of fact, giving circles are evidence of that. I mean, in the giving circle we have is all different types of Black people. They certainly want to give. I know some of you that have known me for a long time know I always say, everybody wants to say yes to something. They just don't know what it is yet. They just have to be asked the right question. So I'm sure there are some that are ready to lend some level of support, but they do need to know what we need, right? So I'm going to move the discussion along a little bit. I'm going to try to keep up with what's going on in the chat box as well. So I want to ask a really pointed question. We've been beating around the bush with this a little bit, all morning, but specifically, what can Black-led nonprofits do to be supportive of advocates? I mean, I'm talking about real time, today, tomorrow, not a year from today. How can we be supportive of people that are leading substantive conversations and sometimes, can get in a bind, and I think it's easy for us to forget that all these shifts we take as a society require somebody else to really put themselves in harm's way sometimes. So how how can we be some more supportive? And what should we be open to offering activists? Jamala.
Oh, I thought that was going to be directed to the folks who are in those nonprofits that
Well, this
get
is
corporate money that are going. How can they help advocacy groups? So
maybe that's it. What is?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what do us that run kind of mainstream nonprofits? What should we be offering you?
I look at it more mutually, because I think each entity has something that the other could benefit from. And so so the thing that I think about probably most is just resources and knowledge, because sometimes people have been in the nonprofit world for a while. They know the landscape, they know the games that get played. And sometimes advocacy groups aren't as astute, because they want to straight and narrow, like, tell me what it is. And I understand that, as opposed to all this other like stuff. But certainly I think some of them are in a position to share resources in ways that they probably haven't thought about. And it may not necessarily mean that they have to even share funding from a particular source, but that actually could happen, particularly because what I've seen sometimes, and you all have probably seen it too, is that somebody gets a big grant and it's supposed to at some point interface with the community, but because that group doesn't have relationships, then that part of the grant just sits because nobody knows how to get it out. And so I'm saying there's an opportunity for them to connect with somebody who has those relationships, but it's still this sort of proprietary thing, like, I don't want to share because then they might end up getting the grant, because then my funder will see that I ain't really able to do this. So I just think that just the honesty and transparency is important. And then, I was on a call the other day where people were saying, even as a advocacy organization, even if they had a place to go make copies or, use the telephone, or, this sounds simple, but somewhere there's a space or office that you're not using or underutilized, and somebody could just maybe come in a couple hours and use the copier. So I'm talking about, like, from the big through the, whole
Yes.
spectrum of support.
Which is exactly where I'm getting at. I think we need to spend some time thinking about things that, while we work very hard to get them, we may take for granted in relative to how much effort it may take, especially grassroots organizations, to get to that. A place to hold a meeting that can fit 100 people might be something that most nonprofits have to prepare for early on, so they have it, right? While groups that pop up in a moment to do real work may not have ready access to that. A copier machine, access to multiple phones with 2 or 3 lines so you can do mass calling, and Wi-Fi, man, the simple stuff, right? And I do believe that that's important, that we think about ways to share those resources and have conversations with the people in our organization so they're comfortable with us doing that. Any other direct comments to that?
Yeah, I have a comment to that. So, like, also just to think about, like, clarifying language, because, like, a lot of grassroots organizations also can qualify under, like, the legal, auspices of nonprofit organizations. And so, and there's different sizes, right? So just because you may be a nonprofit organization that's filed with the feds, right? That assumes that nonprofit has a certain level of resources. So I just wanted to, like, think about that. Also, I heard the term real work be used for just, organization or groups of folks that kind of come together in a moment, right? Which doesn't negate the real work that's happening with organizations that might be more established or more institutionalized, although there are institutions that don't do real work. So just kind of thinking about that there. I'm like, it can go a lot of different ways, but I think that the point still stands that I heard being made is, like, this resource sharing and not really operating from the scarcity mindset. And I think especially when things pop up in the moment, like, so folks that are just kind of coming together because something has happened and they're coming together in reaction to it, or it could be a smaller, already, again, filed with the feds, nonprofit organization, but doesn't have certain resources to their disposal. Like, how are we in connection and community with one another to share those things, right? As an example, I'm sitting here at the CIC building as a part of my organization. And so if there's another group that needs access, like, how can we partner to, figure out how we provide access to a space, to make copies, to get Wi-Fi, to get coffee. I mean, those seemingly simple things are super important. And another thing that I think about, especially in this moment, one, being Black people and folks of color, being the bearers of this institutionalized racism and trauma and all that, how do we support one another's healing? And that's for the folks that are doing advocacy, organizing work, literally on the ground, having the conversations every day, putting their physical bodies in harm's way, but also the folks that are in nonprofit executive spaces where they have to navigate whiteness on a different level. It can be equally mentally taxing and exhausting, and we all need support. We all need healing. We all need space to breathe. So I think about, like, how do we, and I do believe that Deaconess is doing some work around, like, the Healing Fund. I also might not have read my email fully, so don't hold it to me. But I think that's what I saw kind of pop up, is how do we provide healing space for all of us? Because even potentially, I think, if I'm an organizer working with, just kind of a group that's popped up, and I also see the CEO of this large group organization in my same healing space, I can recognize on some level, wow, they're going through it too. You know what I mean? And it kind of breaks this like higher, like this, oh, I see you here, and I have somehow othered you and put you, pedestaled you, or whatever, but like, yo, you going through it too. And we're here in this healing space together. And I think that can be a I don't know, Grant metric can capture this, right? But like another way to really bring people together and recognize that we're all needing some of the same stuff, and truly provide space to, like, break bread and not get some food too, right? But not just like that, not stopping at that level, really breaking bread and having deep conversations about this stuff that goes on. And it can have an impact on, like, this insider outsider strategy, because if I see you in this space and you're going through it too, but I've made this assumption that, man, so-and-so a sellout. He just in his 3-piece suit and attaché case, as my daddy used to say. And he's just doing whatever. He doesn't care about this. He doesn't really know how this feels. But then I see him in this same space with me, and I'm realizing, wait a minute, there's a whole other side to this, and he is my ally in this other way. I don't have a manifesto created around how I think we look, but really thinking about how do we create space where we're together, and not just, passing you in the copy machine in the water cooler, but also laying bare and being vulnerable together in sacred space. How do we think about doing that? So those are my thoughts on that.
Allison, real quick, I would be probably I would RSVP for that space. That is needed.
Yeah,
for sure.
that was great.
So, I think your comment is very poignant. And what's interesting is that Kiara is the first to respond. So what's interesting, and I'm going to tell you why. Kiara and I were in shared space some years ago at a meeting that was being convened by somebody who was not Black. We were talking about the pressures experienced by a variety of people working on issues. And one of the things that Kiara suggested was that there needed to be some type of mental health component to really serve, or to ensure the stability, right? The mental health, that whole issue of self-care for the people who are participating. I guess my question to the group is, are we doing a good job of making ourselves accessible to each other? I think one of the dangers is that maybe we're judging each other. I think it's easy for somebody that may be doing something grassroots level to think that people who are working in a much bigger situation, maybe sold out, or may not be willing to take risks, and people who are in bigger institutions or mainstream institutions to assume that somebody who's doing grassroots work doesn't appreciate the complexity, right, of our situation. So I guess my question, and I'm going to ask specifically to Angela, how do you manage? Are we making ourselves accessible to each other, and is that a challenge? Like, because well, I don't want to talk you into where I would go with that question, but is it difficult, and are we accessible?
So my first answer is for myself. Yes, I'm accessible. I feel like I'm accessible, willing to look to be partnerships with community people, community leaders. But I think sometimes perception of who I work for, the place I work, that I don't always get it. So I will say that. So I will even talk about my organization. It was actually had this experience with a community member. There was a distrust for the organization itself, the Regional Health Commission. And so everybody that worked there was this bit of distrust of, you're just part of the system. You're only saying what they tell you to say. You don't understand community. Was definitely until we had conversation. So as Allison has pushed the OneOnOne, and she actually came to work for us, she was like, oh, wow, you guys are trying. You are doing work. You just having to see the inside of how we have to operate in the system. And I don't think people understand how hard it is to convince somebody that your idea was their idea so they can actually do it. But, you know, operating some of those constraints to try to get movement to respond to community in a way is always challenging. I think from the outside looking in, you don't see a lot of the work that we have to do in order to move people, to move systems, to meet some of the needs of the community that feels like we're addressing their needs in a timely, rapid fashion. It's always a challenge. So I think we're, you know, when you're a Black person inside of a white organ, or at least a organization that represents white culture, although we're serving Black people, there is always this balance of, like, you're playing a game, like you're playing chess. We pick you pick your battles, you challenge where you can, you push where you need, you bring in different other voices, other resources, data, and different things to help make your need. But really, to do it for a community, I can understand how it feels slow, how it feels like you're not being responsible, how you feel like you're not listening. But on the inside, you're like, I'm doing what I can. Just listen. And then partner, and I think about partnering in a way, like, how can your voice at this table help push what I'm trying to do, and having those relationships so they're working in tandem. So that for our advocates, how can your voice help push what people on the inside are trying to say to really get us the outcomes we want to see.
So Angela, the irony of that is the community sometimes say, y'all need to hire some more Black people.
Yeah.
And then they hire some Black people. You will sell out.
Yes, the minute they can identify you. So it is a challenge, and there can be difference in perception in terms of speed. And, you know, to Jamala's point, which is both serious and joking, is that sometimes you can get started and communities can be like, hey, what are you doing? Slow down a second, right?
Right.
And you're trying to meet a need that you feel like has been articulated. Can I ask you guys an honest question? Are we also managing keeping whatever momentum or reputation we have as individual professionals? Does that come into play when we're looking at how accessible we are and what types of relationships we seek? You know, and I think at the root of it, if I can be really honest, I think we know that we have to try twice as hard. We have to be really on point. And as a part of that, assessing other people, and is that fair? Like determining what relationships will be and what information we'll share, you know, and if it's real, how fair is that?
That was really loaded, Brandon. I'm going to.
I'm owning some of that too, you know.
Yeah.
And I have to say, you know, as a kid, I was an activist, and I believe in all anything and everything around social justice, I'm there. But as a professional, I do feel like sometimes I'm negotiating how much of me I share and with who, right? And how much of everything that I believe in, I push out. You know, some of that's gauging like how comfortable my colleagues are and kind of like walking them along. I've been educating some of my colleagues in implicit bias for years. They don't know. They're silently going through an experience with me, right? And educating some of my Black peers, right? So that I can put them in spaces and introduce them. And I guess I'm asking, is that okay? Is that fair?
I think it's fair because from an organizing standpoint, it's really about strategy and tactics. I mean, you don't use the same tactics for every situation. So, you know, you size it up, you assess it, you see, you know, how close people align with your values, and then, you know, you move accordingly. So I don't think it's a negative. I think, as Angela pointed out, when there's misperceptions that you continue to hold on to without fully allowing that person to dispel some of that, is where we block off, you know, opportunities and access to people and places that, you know, could be a benefit to us and to our organizations.
I would also add to that, like, I'm a I'm an activist and a professional. Two things can be true at the same time. And so I think though there's always something around like calculated vulnerability, and that's an individual choice. I can't make that decision for somebody else because what they have to lose, I can maybe, if I'm in a relationship with someone, I can push someone, right? And push them in out of love and like, you know, thinking about like the story of self. I'm like, man, so-and-so, you didn't share your story. And I know it's so powerful and I'd push you to share it more, but ultimately that's a choice that I have to respect for someone else because what they could, what's at risk and what's at stake is different for everybody. But I think like being clear about like, yeah, I think it's important to be vulnerable because in open as much as possible or as much as is safe for someone to do, because that's where connection happens, right? That's where maybe I can stop othering you as this, you know, corporate professional, and I know more about your story and have a better understanding of like the space that you're in, so I can operate with more empathy and we can build true relationship with folks. So I think it is, vulnerability is important, but calculated vulnerability, not so where it's fake and performative, but like you have to know what you're willing to, that's where your internal work comes from, taking a moment to sit with yourself and think about what am I willing to share, what am I willing to put out at risk, and accept, you know, the consequences, good or bad, but that's a decision everyone has to make. But I think that sharing is super important in having real conversations and dialogue. Like it's how we get the work done. And so people have to really though sit for a moment for themselves and be like, what am I willing to share? What am I willing to be vulnerable about? How am I willing to own my story? Because if I don't own it, someone else will own it for me. I mean, use it against me. So those are just some thoughts I had on that point.
So I'm going to take burning comments. I want to acknowledge that we are at the end of time. Do we have any burning comments before I do closing? Everybody's good? Okay.
I just want to say I love being a part of this panel of some great Black women.
Yes.
Doing great work. So it's a healing space, as Allison talked about. So definitely seeing others in the space, having the same issues, doing the fight to try to do best for our community is very great for a Tuesday. So thank you.
Any burning comments?
Make sure that this is not the last time as we talk about the healing and staying in communication with one another, which is really important. We can't operate in silos. Like there's a lot that I've been taking notes on that I've learned from each of you during today's session. So I'm looking forward to it.
Same here.
How are you, Jamala?
I'm good. This made my day.
So look, I want to first thank all the panelists for agreeing to participate today. I think this was a fantastic start to Black Philanthropy Month. I would encourage the audience to tune in. There are 5 more sessions. You can go to the website, see what they are, sign up for them if you haven't already. I would encourage people to talk to each other. I think if there's some big takeaways is that there's some opportunities for dialogues between people that do different types of work, but intersect with the same population. And there's an opportunity for us to understand and to get to know each other better, right? And certainly leverage one another's experiences and resources in a way that helps us achieve some better goals, better outcomes for the people that we care about. So with that, I want to thank everybody. Stay tuned next Tuesday. Thank you. Have a great one.
You guys,
Thanks everyone. Peace.
thank you all.